once you're alerted to a danger that will go against you, not a wanted danger, but an unwanted one, that immediately reduces the possibilities of pleasure. My experience when I interviewed women, when invited to speak about their sexuality, memories of their mother filtered in to what they were saying. First, the awareness that their mother's sexual life existed. Feminism seems to suggest that certain kinds of sexual men are not worth loving or being in bed with. That's feminism creates a hierarchy of acceptable masculinities, right? The construct of the feminist superego or police, if you will. Hi, I'm Amrita Narayanan. I'm a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst, and I'm based in Goa. This book is the result of almost 11 years into the thinking about and writing and making of it.
So, Amrita, could you tell us about your book? What were you setting out to explore? What were you looking to discover?
So, growing up in India, I had this feeling that there was a real complexity to the way women's sexualities were experienced in their inner world, not simply what we said to each other about it, but how we were feeling inside about it. And there seemed to be a missing language, if you will, to talk about this. And I sat with that missing language and was having a conversation about it, but looking for more words in which to think about what was going on. And I found some of that language in psychoanalysis, but I still felt there was a smallness to the conversation. So this is the third of 3 works that I have done on the subject of women's sexuality, and I think it's my last one. But as I progressed through the works, each time I think I was trying to widen the conversation for myself to know what other voices were thinking and feeling under Freudian slip there, under these circumstances.
I think rapture and distress are 2 interesting counterpoints, which is also the subhead of your book, to talk about women's sexuality in modern-day India.
Inner Rapture of Distress is it's actually from a poem by Auden. You'll find it on the front page of the book. The actual excerpt is, "Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress." It has many layers to it. First off, I think you have to be a bit enraptured with distress to listen to women's sexual stories closely under these circumstances, because there's always distress present in these stories. Secondly, I think there's a possibility, and I think the international community on the surface is very much enraptured with the distress aspect of women's sexuality in India. You know, when it comes to distress around women's sexuality, I think we're so attuned to protecting women from distress that there's stories of women whose distress is that they're not getting their sexual needs met, or that they're not able to advocate for themselves sexually. Those stories don't show up as much on our radar because our focus is on stories of violation and how to prevent that, and which is of course very important as well. But I think there's a tendency to miss this element of the trauma, that there's so much less sexual self-advocacy, so much less speaking up for yourself sexually and finding your sexual voice than women would like, and that they should be able to access. We miss it because we're paying more attention to the cries of distress. And it's worth thinking about how distress can be exciting for people. First, to the outside observers, there's something about distress that gets us riled up in a way that is enlivening. And it's worth thinking about what happens there in those circumstances, because if someone's distress is enlivening to us, we might miss their rapture. So the pairing is a way of reminding us also how tricky these two pulls can be.
Because your book is on the modern sexuality of Indian women, and the story that really struck us was Shibani's story. Because for us, we thought it brings together many contradictions, impulses, desires, also structural points that inform modern Indian woman's negotiation with her own sexuality. When we read it, it was also a revelation for us that actually this is what is happening when we read Shibani's story. Could you tell us about Shibani and what she has revealed in the book? And tell us some of the stories you have heard during the making of this.
She was, at the time I interviewed her, around 27, feeling very free in her sexuality, and was happily engaging in sexual encounters. But there was a kind of something like a backlash in these experiences. And when we spoke together, she would talk about how she would have a one-night stand or frequently engage in casual sex with her choice of partners, and then immediately afterwards was besieged with these feelings of panic, depression, insomnia, feeling like she was going nuts. And what was really interesting about these symptoms was that she connected them in her mind to her family finding out that she was enjoying casual sex. Now, she lived hundreds of kilometers from her family. There were not people in the neighborhood who knew her family. So in that sense, it was quite far from her everyday reality, this possibility of being outed and discovered. And yet she had this closet style of experience in her sexuality where the fun and the pleasure, which was very clear in her presence, that she was enjoying herself, had a chapter 2 to it, as it were, in which she got into, I would say, imaginary conversations with family members whom she thought would think ill of her. And when she sat with me, she was often talking as much to these family members as to me. On one side, she was very much, for herself, for her agency, and in tune with her sexuality. And then on the other side, there was this alarm, panic, and almost anachronistic experience of paying for it, of, I wouldn't say a repentance, but apology. She would spend a lot of time apologizing to absent family members who were never going to find out about this. But they occupied a place in her imagination. And it would be so that a fairly random person in her immediate community would trigger this memory of a family member. What I described in the book is that there's an older woman at her work, and it was as if she would project onto this older woman the ideas that came from her traditional Punjabi family, and she would experience them as if they were coming from this woman who had no idea really about what was going on for her. But Shibani's feeling was that this woman at her workplace was going to judge her, and she was reacting to these feelings. Shibani is a very interesting example of how these patriarchal ideas of sexuality persist in the imagination. One of the things that struck me in Shibani's story as I was listening to her is that some of the things that she was saying to the man and to herself seemed to be the voices of family members. And why bring that in? Why are family members' voices active, advocating for marriage in a situation where she doesn't particularly want to get married? My feeling about it is that Shibani's family gave her a great sense of rootedness and belonging. She was happy growing up with this family. And there was something about the aloneness of being an individual and taking individual decisions that was very difficult for her. And this fantasy or imagined presence of the family was a way in which she could have them close to her in a situation where actually they wouldn't be close to her in a reality. So, in some way, I thought it was her way of not being alone in the circumstances, and instead being accompanied by patriarchal family members who very much would fight for her, would demand for this marriage, would make sure that her honor was not sullied in the situation. So that was my reading of it, that it was a way of being together, of belonging, rather than being alone in this moment of agency. And that line between moralizing and protective, for I don't think they mean to be moralizing, I think they mean to be protective. But what is this it that's getting protected at that time? And do we all agree on what needs protection? And even the presence of that word, protection, it does something to how women experience their sexuality.
What does it do? What does this idea of protection do to...
It alerts you to a danger that would be against your consent. And once you're alerted to a danger that will go against you, not a wanted danger, but an unwanted one, that immediately reduces the possibilities of pleasure. It sets off your stress response, if you will, your alarm system. And someone may not be moralizing, but they may read the situation in a way that sets off the alarm system. And as you saw in that story of Shibani, it was her internalized alarm system that was getting set off repeatedly after these casual sexual experiences. And that was triggering all these symptoms in her. So many of those symptoms were her way of missing her parents, missing their protective force, which unfortunately also was a moralizing force. But one can still miss that protective ears and hands of the parents in these very unusual ways. There was a way in which parents regulated the sexuality of young girls, over-regulated it, without being conscious that this would have a future consequence for them, a consequence not simply in their sexuality, but in the way that they negotiated the world at large. That's the nature of the trauma. And the trauma was caused by parents whose allegiance to the patriarchal family, not patriarchy in the abstract, but rather patriarchy in the real, in the grandparents and parents and uncles and aunts that needed to be pleased by a certain feminine performance. Their parents' allegiance to that patriarchy and that kind of feminine performance was much stronger than their awareness that young girls, as much as young boys, receive need sexual freedom to, run around in their chadis, for example. Just small actions that allow them to assert freedom in their bodies.
In your book, you have, in great detail and persuasive ways, talked about the role of the mother, especially how it informs women's sexuality. Amrita, could you talk to us a little about that?
My experience when I interviewed women was that when invited to speak about their sexuality, the link and the association to their mother's sexuality was very, very close. So almost as soon as prompted to speak about their own sexuality, their reverie, their memories of their mother filtered in to what they were saying. So in almost every case, the women spoke intimately about a couple of different moments in time. First, the awareness that their mother's sexual life existed. And in particular, when their mother had an unhappy sexual life that they either knew for a fact or imagined or inferred um, this impinged upon women's own experience. It suffused them with a kind of a guilt. And that guilt, which I think of as survivor guilt in some respect, makes it difficult for them to enjoy their own sexuality as thoroughly as their new reality allows them to.
You have also talked about the role feminism plays in determining a modern woman's sexuality, determining / controlling. Would you like to talk a little about that?
Some of the women that I spoke to felt that they had to answer to feminism for their for sexual actions in their life, and they seemed to regard feminism far from being purely a source of support. They seemed to regard feminism as something like a moral police, and there were many layers of confusion around this. One is the idea that feminism seems to suggest that certain kinds of sexual men are not worth loving or being in bed with. That's feminism creates a hierarchy of acceptable masculinities, which makes it complicated for women who love or desire outside of that hierarchy or at the bottom end of that hierarchy. Some of the women that I spoke to felt spied upon by the feminist police, that they had to hide their sexuality. Again, this is a somewhat imagined as well as real construct, right? The construct of the feminist superego or police, if you will. But in the imagination of some women, liking certain kinds of men, for example, powerful men that have been Me Too'd, or men who have a very aggressive demeanor, there are certain kinds of masculinities that seem to produce a shame in front of the feminist community. There's actually so much cost that I couldn't quite list it all out, but perhaps the most appalling cost, or the worst, if you will, is that that this would create within a woman a feeling of being appalled at one's own desire. To me, that's the worst cost of all. There's a general restriction, of course. There's a way in which the restriction is enjoyed in order to adapt to it. But perhaps the worst is this self-hatred of one's own desires. After these interviews, I think of Secrecy more and more as a way in which people preserve autonomy. And for there are three women in particular in that chapter on Secrecy who were able to use secrecy as a way of being an agent in their sexual lives. That if they had been pressed to be earnest and transparent, then they wouldn't have had much of a sexual life. In each of those cases, secrecy allowed them an area that fell outside of the legislation of feminism as well as patriarchy. It created a closed world for them in which they could experience their longings and their sexual pleasure and enact them so long as nobody knew about it. So I think that it was part of their feminism in those cases, the secrecy, that allowed, and by feminism I mean sex-positive feminism, that allowed them to be more of the sexual agents that they wanted to be via this medium of secrecy.
And finally, Amrita, what we are curious about is, what is your fantasy about the female collective, which is maybe counter to the community body, but is also sort of rich in what it can offer to female sexuality in general?
Well, I think an ideal female collective both celebrates and recognizes agential sexuality, as well as recognizing the desire to belong, to have a community body and to belong in the community body, without seeing these two as contradictory. And so such a female collective doesn't demand for proof of either agency or of community belongingness, but rather accepts that women kind of go in and out of these states and bodies, if you will, without considering this to be contradictory in any way. So that's one element. I think the other one is captured in the picture that the student, actually not interviewee, the student Abhilasha paints from Lipstick Under My Burqa, which is that women give each other space to progress at different paces. And when I say progress, I mean be agents of their sexuality in ways that suit them, without diminishing any of these ways. So I think the voices that we hear a little bit more clearly these days is that younger women, want to perform their sexuality in certain ways that are very overt, and we want to give space to that, but also to give space to the older women's sexuality that's far more understated or performed in ways that a generation or two younger her cannot recognize, but to provide those recognizing eyes to a diverse range of sexualities, and to say that all of these are legitimate ways of exercising agency. To me, that would be very important for the female collective. So it becomes less about just about individual agency, which I think is important and should be supported, but also about how do we all live together, given the fact that we've had different experiences and have different realities, but also different inner worlds. And then how do we all live together and still celebrate each other, given this difference between women? And that there's no we, in a way, in the women's movement, because we all have had different experiences.